Hello everyone. Welcome to today's talk, which is part of the Glocor Conservations on Quran Translation. And today we have a very interesting talk, which is about the eye of the unbeliever, script, modernity, and translations of the Quran in South India. The topic will be presented by Torsten Tschacher, who is a Heidelberg Fellow at the German Research Foundation, DFG, at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He's researching the history and discursive traditions of Tamil-speaking Muslim around the Bay of Bengal. So I'm looking very forward to this discussion and talk. The floor is all yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I shall try to share my presentation. Wait, this is always something of a challenge. So let me see whether I'm able to. No. So can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Right. So, yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very exciting lecture series. And I hope I can contribute something and hopefully join a somewhat larger discussion, because what I'm going to present, of course, is something that emerges very much from the peculiar situation that I face in the region that I work on, namely in southern India, and I shall in a moment tell you a little bit more about what that precisely is supposed to mean. But I also hope that this is something that may prove interesting for people engaged in studying Quran translations and their sort of social and cultural context in other parts of the world. So basically, what I'm looking at is a situation where traditionally, when people have studied Quran translation in South India, which is in any case not so frequent, but in any case, if people study it, there has been a tendency to look at Quran translation primarily through a sort of sectarian or ideological lens. That is, the assumption that Quran translation closely is connected with particular theological positions, that these positions are actually articulated in the specific translations of the Quran, and that there is a sort of, let's say, a push factor in the production of Quran translation that is based on particular forms of sectarianism. So somewhat parallel, at least within the South Indian context, to what people have studied about Bible translations, where Bible translations really become a sort of almost a catalyst for the formation of new sections within various churches. So various communities form because they follow particular Bible translations. And somehow the assumption has always been that we are looking at something very similar in the case of Quran translation. Furthermore, there is an even larger argument that simply assumes that there was a tendency to consider Quran translation as something contentious within the Muslim community, and that basically we can distinguish two large camps within those communities, one being a camp that is ready to translate, and that usually is associated in the 20th century with various reform projects. And on the other side, a traditionalist camp that is plainly and simply opposed to translating the Quran in any way whatsoever. And this has become a truism to the degree that whenever one tries to point out that actually you have examples of Quran translation from precisely the context that supposedly was opposed to it, the answer very commonly is, but these were not translations. So one is immediately thrown to the question of what precisely is a Quran translation as opposed to something else, a commentary, etc. And the assumption that there is something that we may legitimately call translation, and then there are things that are clearly not translation, so that we can make a clear distinction between translation and non-translation is a part of the basic assumption about the existence of Quran translation in South India. So usually Quran translations in the region are seen as the work of people who are considered to be modern, if you want to qualify them positively. If you want to qualify them negatively, then you get words such as puritanical or fundamentalist. People generally interested in the reform of Muslim society versus people that are supposed to be traditionalists who wanted to have things remain as they are, and who, again, depending on which camp you're in, you will label as obscurantist, or you will label them as careful and scholarly and not wanting to, give the impression that just by translating the Quran, you immediately become a master of everything Islamic. So basically, we have this distinction, and it is utilized by both camps, right? So no matter whether you identify yourself within the reformist camp in any way, or whether you situate yourself in the traditionalist camp, the assumption that the reformist camp does Quran translation and the traditionalist camp does not is sort of a basic given in the context. Now, what I'm interested in and what I want to be talking about today is something that really doesn't look at so much at the what one might call ideological or theological aspects of this whole debate, but that actually looks at the context of producing Quran translations. And that means looking at technologies of producing them. That means to a certain degree also looking at the economy in which these translations are produced, and who is actually targeted by these translations. And it is through asking these kind of questions, and I shall ask these questions through the help of looking at script. And again, this is something I will explain in a moment, what script means in that particular context. That then brings us to new insights into what notions of translations are we actually dealing with. And that also leads us then to the question of in how far are Quran translations connected to notions of community and of various social formations and networks that we generally associate them with. So in order to immediately jump into the subject matter, let's take a look at a court case that was fought in Singapore in January 1926. It's sometimes known as the Singapore libel case or the Singapore Muslim libel case specifically. This was a case which was brought by two South Indian Muslims, Miran Labem Mu'alim and K.C. Marakan, against a man called J. Muhammad Ismail Marakan and the printing press that he owned, the Straits Printing Works. The context was that 2 years earlier, in a little bit more than 1 year earlier, in 1924, 1925, a contentious publisher had come from a man called P. Daud Shah, whom you see in the picture on the right-hand side, had come from South India to Malaya and Singapore to basically get subscriptions for the Quran translation that he was producing. And he had already published 2 volumes of that translation. Now, Daud Shah had, in the beginning of the 1920s, worked at the Woking Mission for a time. He was very close to Khwaja Kamaluddin, and so, as you can imagine, he had immediately been labeled and identified as an Ahmadi. And basically what this Ismail Marakan and his printing press had done, they had published a handbill in which Daud Shah was labeled as a kafir, and then it was said anyone who supports a kafir is a kafir himself. So basically all those people who help and support Daud Shah are apostates, and they don't really belong to the Muslim community. And so two of the people who were explicitly by name mentioned in this handbill shifted to the courts and said, listen, this is libellous and we want to have damages paid. Now, the interesting thing about the case is that the British lawyer representing the defendant, so the Straits Printing Works, he adopted a rather curious strategy. He said, well, this is not libel because it's true, right? As Ahmadis, you follow ideas, or as supporters of Dawud Shah, you basically are Ahmadis, and as Ahmadis, you follow ideas that make you kafirs, and you cannot claim to be a Muslim. So the defendants accepted the burden of proof, and this British lawyer tries for the rest of the case rather unsuccessfully to prove that indeed Ahmadis are kafirs. And one of the arguments he introduces quite early in the case is the claim that it is impermissible to translate the Quran into any other language but Arabic. So the explicit exchange between the judge, is it supposed to be a sin to translate the Quran into any other language but Arabic? And the attorney for the defense says, my instructions are that it is forbidden to do so. And for the rest of the case, this claim that it is prohibited to translate the Quran hangs in the room. The judge basically in the end says it's ridiculous to claim that Muslims are not allowed to translate the Quran, but he accepts that the party represented by the defense lawyer and by the Straits Printing Works are actually believing that it is not allowed to Muslims to translate the Quran. So there's this whole assumption there that basically this is a fight about the permissibility to translate the Quran. But when you look a little bit carefully within the case, you very quickly realize that things don't quite work out. And the most obvious instance where you find this is in the contentious handbill itself, where twice the issue of translation and publishing Quran translations is brought up. The first is in a section that, for the benefit of the court, has been labeled paragraph 15b, and that states, and the transcription of our sacred and true scripture, the Holy Quran, in non-Arabic script are haram, right? So there's another thing that is stated to be haram, and one of the things that is stated to be haram is that you cannot put the Quran into any other script but Arabic. And the other statement in paragraph 17b says, and the fact of the existence of our tafsir, which is explained as commentaries, in the Arabicized Tamil, serves to obviate the possibility of the Tamils with Tamil script slighting our religion. So when you read this carefully, you realize the handbill is not opposed at all to Quran translation. It is opposed to publish these translations using the Tamil script rather than the Arabic script. And so the issue actually is not one about translation. The issue is about in what script do I publish the translation that I have prepared. And this question is basically something that is missed through the whole, or was missed through the whole discussion of this particular libel case. And that actually, I would say, lies at the heart of pretty much most of the attempts to translate the Quran in South India in the colonial period. So let me briefly introduce you to the South Indian setting as far as Islam is concerned, because I suspect that probably not many of you will be familiar with this. So the extreme south of India holds a number of various languages, out of which, beside a language known as Dakhni, which is often claimed to be a dialect of Urdu, which in my opinion is debatable, the two most important languages for the use of Muslim communities are Tamil and Malayalam. So Malayalam is spoken in what is nowadays the Indian state of Kerala and the Union Territory of Lakshadweep on the extreme southwest coast. And Tamil is spoken in the state of Tamil Nadu on the southeast coast of India, and of course in parts of northern, eastern, and central Sri Lanka. Both Malayalam and Tamil were used in writing by Muslims since at least the 16th century, probably a bit earlier for inscriptions. The first literary texts that we possess in Tamil, first Islamic literary text dates to 1572-73. In Malayalam, a little bit later in 1607. So this may seem a little bit late, but as far as Indian vernaculars is concerned, the 16th, 17th century is really the period in which vernacular Islamic writing really comes in into its own in many other parts of South Asia as well. So, for example, in Bengali, it's a very similar situation. Another thing that is important to note that at least until the 19th century, both Malayalam and Tamil discourses, Islamic discourses, are pretty much independent of the Urdu discourses of northern India. So, in fact, the first really serious engagement with Urdu comes in the course of the shift or of the opening of a branch of the Ahmadiyya in Madras in the early 20th century. What we should also mention that at least for Tamil, for Malayalam, it's a bit more difficult to say, but at least for Tamil, we are speaking about a relatively high literacy rate among Muslims, at least among Muslim men. Women, again, is a more difficult case, but the male literacy rate in Tamil for Muslims in 1901 is larger than 19.3%. It's a bit difficult to exactly determine it, but this is more than 3 times as much as the average literacy rate for Muslim males in the rest of India. So we are talking about communities that, while they were numerically relatively small, there was still a market for Islamic books and printing because you had a fairly high literacy rate. Now, the interesting thing about the 2 languages is that when you look at Quran translation in Tamil and in Malayalam, we see a very similar sort of narrative and picture about the development of Quran translation. The basic idea you usually get is that Quran translation begins supposedly as a sort of reformist endeavor in the 1920s and 30s. So in the interwar period, we have a couple of partial translations, Dawood Shah in the case of Tamil between 1924 and 1930. And in the case of Malayalam, the person usually seen as the pioneer is Vakum Maulavi, who runs several newspapers, and in one of his newspapers has a column in which he attempts to translate the Quran. He doesn't get very far because he unfortunately dies relatively early. But this is basically where Quranic translation supposedly starts. However, the first complete translations then are only produced after Indian independence, in the case of Tamil in 1949 by Abdul Hamid Bakawi, whose translation was actually started in 1926, but it took till 1949 to publish it in a single volume. And in the case of Malayalam, it's the translation of C.N. Ahmad Maulavi between 1953 and 1961. So this is the basic story you would be told. But the intriguing thing is that in both cases, we actually have translations, Quranic translations, and some of them really complete, of the complete Quran, using not the local Tamil and Malayalam alphabets and scripts, but the Arabic script already in the 19th century. And the intriguing thing is that this period of the history of Quranic translation is generally overlooked. And if it is pointed out, there are usually 2 answers. The first answer is that, well, these are not translations, they're actually commentaries. They cannot really be seen in the same vein as, say, the translations of Dawood Shah or of Ahmad Maulavi. And the other answer is to say, well, because they use the Arabic script, they're not really Tamil or Malayalam translations. So they're not really in the same language, and that makes them something different. And that brings us to the somewhat curious case of the use of the Arabic script in South India. We don't quite know when Tamil and Malayalam were first written in Arabic script, but the most likely guess is that this happens around the same time when the sort of literary culture around these two languages, Islamic literary culture, emerges in the late 16th century. It's clearly emerging out of Indian Ocean networks. This far is visible by the kind of the way that letters are adopted to write sounds which are there in Tamil and in Malayalam, but which are absent in Arabic. Another curious thing is that usually these texts are written with full vowel diacritics, precisely because not doing so makes them nearly unreadable. And furthermore, we have the utilization of a limited number of special consonants and even two special vowel signs in order to indicate all the important sounds in these languages that Arabic doesn't possess. There are also some differences between the way the Arabic script is used, apart from the fact that these special consonant and vowel signs are not quite identical in Malayalam and in Tamil. There is one major difference in the way the Arabic script is used in both languages, namely that by the 19th century, the Muslims in Malabar, that is the northern part of Kerala, which is really where the focus and the dominance of the Muslim community lies, were basically only using the Arabic script, right? So there was not really the use of any other script for writing Malayalam by Muslims at that time. Whereas on the East Coast, in the Tamil areas, both the Arabic script and the Tamil script are sort of used side by side, often by the same individuals. Now, as I've already mentioned, if we turn to the Quran, the curious thing is that we actually have a relatively long history of Quran translation in that region. We find, at least in the Tamil textual corpus, which is larger than the Malayalam one, we find individual Quranic verses translated already in the 18th, possibly 17th century. So it's not really that people seem to have shied away from giving the meaning of at least individual ayahs. The first Quran translations, which actually cover the whole of the Quran, are published in the Arabic script, as mentioned. These are in Malayalam, the translation of Mayam Kuti Elaya, which starts in 1870-71. I'm not quite sure that it's 6 volumes. I've to date only been able to see one of the volumes completely. So I'm not quite sure how long it took him to complete the project. And in Tamil, it's 2 projects which are done roughly at the same time by Habib Muhammad al-Qahiri and Nuh bin Abdul Qadir al-Qahiri, which are completed in the early 1880s, so about 10 years after the Malayalam one. In addition to these complete translations, we have a couple of partial translations, usually of ritually important sections, such as Surat Yasin or the 30th Juz in both languages. And at least in Tamil, we also have the curious case that we have publications of individual surahs, such as Surat Yasin, in the Arabic language, but in Tamil script. So also this kind of engagement with the Quran is there. So the question that really comes up when one looks at this corpus of early Quran translation in Arabic script is, number one, what explains why people have forgotten that these translations exist? And number two, why? Because all of these translations actually come out of a rather sort of traditionalist section of the ulama. Why, especially amongst contemporary South Indian Reform Muslims, even those of a Salafi bent, we actually get a rejection of the Arabic script. We actually find people very actively saying, we are not going to use the Arabic script for our translations. And this is a rather curious thing that basically brought me to this topic. And I'll try in the time that is left to me to give you a few preliminary answers as to why the Arabic script was used in the first place and how it came to be that it was more or less abandoned and forgotten in the context of Quran translations. Now, the first thing that we have to talk about is in India, the use of script is commonly interpreted as a case of expressing identity. And a language isn't really a language unless it has its own script, right? I mean, I still remember I sometimes had these situations where people asked me, do you have any German newspaper with you? And then I would show them a newspaper and they would say, but that's English, right? Because the script was the Latin alphabet. The assumption was a proper self-respecting language would have its own individual script that it doesn't share with anyone else. Now, the intriguing thing when we look at the question of Quran translations, however, is that far more than a question of identity, in many ways, this is a question of technology and a question of layout. So what script I use and how I use it determines, or rather the other way around, what access to technology I have determines what I can actually do with script. So the Arabic script actually posed a technological challenge because usually you would need a lithographic printing press. Arabic was in South Asia practically always printed in lithography. Whereas the South Indian languages and the script of Tamil and Malayalam had long adopted letterpress printing, which for these scripts was very easy to do. So using the Arabic script meant you had to have access to lithography, you had to have access to a professional calligrapher. But then on the other hand, lithography gave you greater freedom in layout, in decorating your text, and so on and so forth. So just to give you an idea of what the challenges could be that you were faced with, let's just look at a few different layouts of early Quran translations. So this is a case of a text where you have the text of the Quran in Arabic script in a rather large and bold size, and in the little boxes below, you basically have an interlinear translation into Tamil in Arabic script. And this is something that lithography allowed you to do relatively easily. It would have been far more difficult to do this with the Tamil script because the Tamil script would have run in the opposite direction. It would have required somebody who was capable of writing the Tamil script. And in effect, many of the early Quran translations were actually printed with lithopresses whose scribes didn't know Tamil. They knew the Arabic script, so they could copy a manuscript and could do so beautifully, but they wouldn't have known how to write Tamil. So it was much easier to keep everything in the Arabic script. And you could do it even more easily by basically not going interlineary, but basically have just the Arabic text, somewhat bold in the beginning, and then add the translation in Tamil in a somewhat smaller script, phrase by phrase, so to speak. The moment you bring either the Tamil or the Malayalam script in, you would have to seriously be able to accommodate that on the page. And this on the left-hand side is the first case of that I'm aware of a translation of the partial translation of the Quran into Tamil script. And you can see this this was a yeah, it was probably, how do you say aufwendig in English? It was probably a somewhat complex endeavor to produce this book with all the decorations, with the different scripts being used, and all keeping in these nice little boxes. So to make this an aesthetic endeavor already was a difficult issue. And you can see that if you compare it with this translation, where for some reason, and this is the only example known to me, the translator chose to forego the inclusion of the Arabic text. And you basically just have the translation into Tamil, right? This was, of course, fairly easy to print, but you wouldn't have the Arabic original along with the text, which to many Muslims was anathema. So this was something which really only very reformist people were ready to do. Now, such mundane questions of layout, of what technology to use, I would argue also have an impact then of what people think actually is entailed in the idea of a translation. So most of modern observers operate with the notion that there's a clear differentiation between what is a translation and what is a commentary, right? And you very often hear this argument, no, basically Elia is not a translation of the Quran, it's a translation of the Jalalain, right? It's not, it's directly translating the commentary, and so you have something very different. When you actually look into these texts, you realize that these early texts cannot simply be labeled as commentaries. Yes, of course. That was their purpose. They were supposed to explain the Quran to an audience that didn't know Arabic. And therefore, you often hear the text being referred to, in Tamil at least, as an ure, which means a commentary. And very often also as part of the title, you will find the word tafsir. But at the very same time, this word ure, or commentary, more often than not translates the Arabic word tarjuma. So basically, it's not easy to say that these early translations were translations of commentaries, rather that the distinction between what is a commentary and what is a translation was very weak, right? Basically, any form of translation was seen as some form or the other to explain and therefore to comment the original text. So basically, this was the whole purpose of Quran translation, the only permitted one according to Shafi'i law, that you basically explain the Quran in another language, right? And this directly then feeds into the question of what precisely is a translation. A translation is a way of explaining some sort of original text. So a translation pretty much does the same job as a commentary. And there's no real strict distinction between these two kinds of engagements. There are different kinds of commentaries that are distinguished, but that you find even within these old Quran translations. So one of the early Tamil Quran translations, you will have first the Quranic verse, then you have the gloss on that verse, and then you have either a little line or you have some sort of verbal marker stating take note, and then come further explanations, right? So this is something that is, exactly, this is basically this slide, that is very much conveyed through the layout of these early translations. So for example, on the left-hand side, this is one of the first complete Tamil translations of the Quran. So you have basically the Quran on the left-hand side, the Arabic text, and the interlinear Tamil glossing of that text. And then here on the right-hand side, in the margins, there you have further explanations and commentaries on various points in the text, again in Tamil. So there's a clear distinction between different layers of commenting on the Quranic text. And on the right-hand side, this is what I mentioned to you just now. So you have first the Quranic text, then you have the gloss, and then you have a marker. In this case, it's the word arindakol, so something like know or take note, and then come further explanations. Or in this case, you just have a little dash that notifies the reader, okay, this is where the gloss on the Quranic text ends, and this is where the commentary begins. So it's not really that people didn't distinguish at least different ways of explaining the Quran and distinguish between something that is more or less a literal translation and on the other hand, a more detailed explanation. But both serve the same purpose, namely to explain the Quran in another language. Now, this in the course of the 20th century changes, and the question more and more becomes, can you have an independent translation? Can you have a translation that is not based on commentary? And this is basically what reformers claim, and this is also basically where they fail, because when you actually look at their texts, you realize that many times their translations are as much dependent on a particular earlier translation or a particular commentary as were the traditionalist commentaries that were published in the Arabic script. Now, the distinction between translation and commentary, however, is ever more emphasized by technological changes. And therefore, the choice of script and of printing technology actually goes directly into what we understand is a proper translation. So I shall give just one example, namely that of what happens when we actually seem to be adding words to the Quranic text that do not seem to be there in the original Arabic text. And you can see a very interesting development with that. And I shall just give the example of Al-Fatiha 3, so Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. In one of the first complete Tamil translations, these two words were translated rather voluminously, right, as the one compassionate towards everyone in worldly life. In Tamil, these are 3 words rather than 1 in Arabic, and the compassionate towards the believers in the hereafter. And again, I think it is 3 words in the Tamil where the Arabic uses just 1 word. So in modern times, such translations are not seen as translations. People will say, well, that's already an explanation of what the Arabic word means. But on the other hand, you can say, yeah, but this is exactly what it means, or at least what it is supposed to mean. And so here, Arabic may be content with the 1 word, but in Tamil, you will have to use 3 words to explain what the meaning of that 1 word is. However, what we see is increasingly a condensation where this explanation is not given anymore as part of the translation. So in 1926, this is basically what is ultimately to become the most standard of all Quran translations in Tamil. The translator uses still 2 words, but the 2 adjectives he uses incomparably and boundlessly basically have nothing to do with the Quranic texts, one might say. So in modern Tamil, it is very common to translate Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim as Arulalan and Balan. So you just have exactly 1 word equivalent to the Arabic word. But the difference between Arulalan and Anbalan in Tamil is not the same as the difference between Rahman and Rahim in Arabic. And therefore now you have to somewhere add a footnote or a commentary explaining to people what actually that difference is supposed to be. And one possibility of doing that we find in a translation of 1937, where you do have an attempt to make that difference between Rahman and Rahim clear, but it is placed in an invention that is basically taken from the Western script, and that is brackets. So the bracket sort of notifying the reader, this is an addition for explanation by the translator, and it's not really, and one might dispute that, part of the Quranic text. All in all these questions about script, layout, and the way that you basically present your translation lead up to something that I would like to call the ethics of textuality. So this is something for Tamil, this has been formulated by scholar Bernard Bate, who basically talks about how during the 19th century we have a change in the manner that texts were supposed to be composed, distributed, and consumed. And basically he posits that under the pressure of Protestant ethics of textuality, there was a push towards making text generally shared and generally understandable within a putative language community, and that textual practices that were not generally shared broke this projected unity and were therefore seen as illegitimate. And the critique of the use of the Arabic script becomes precisely part of this change in the ethics of textuality, because until the 19th century, script in South India mattered really only for among those for whom the text was meant. So nobody complained when Muslims wrote a text in Arabic script, because nobody was really interested in reading Muslim texts unless they were Muslim. So we actually have many, many different scripts in use for Tamil and Malayalam. And what happens basically in the 19th century is all over South Asia, due to British policies and the development of print culture, we see the development of what one might call these national script cultures, in which every language, every major language tries to acquire its own distinctive national script. So the use of the Arabic script then becomes a disruption of this unity. And this in South India becomes even more problematic. We have, of course, the famous Hindi-Urdu controversy in North India. But in South India, this becomes even more problematic because all these Muslims are basically seen as just Malayalis and Tamils who converted to Islam. So they're basically Muslim Malayalis and they're basically Muslim Tamils. And therefore, it is seen as natural that they should be addressed in standardized Malayalam and standardized Tamil, because this is basically what is proper for their racial context. And I have an article which is bound to appear in a few weeks' time, which deals precisely with this question of race in these reform discourses. So basically, in all of this, anything that looks mixed, such as using the Arabic script for Dravidian languages, or the mixed race elites who claim to have descendants among Arabs, have ancestors among the Arabs that were pushing them, become sort of suspicious in the eyes of a general reading public. And the curious counterexample to this is British Ceylon, where the Muslims are actually recognized by the late 19th century as a separate race, as a separate ethnic group. And even though they speak Tamil, they are not really put under the same scrutiny by other Tamil speakers as they are in India. Furthermore, script becomes a prime marker of being modern, and this happens basically because you have this language standardization, which works in tandem with a whole lot of changes that I can't really talk about here in the general textual culture, the shift to a particular prose style, which wasn't really there before. And this modern prose style and the use of the proper Tamil or Malayalam script become part of the public schooling system. And they become part of reformist discourses among the elites, among Hindus, among Christians. And well, you can imagine many Muslim reformers felt the need that they basically needed to address themselves to this modernity, to this colonial modernity that was suddenly being presented in these modern prose styles and in these particular scripts. And one very nice example for this question of modernity in case of Daud Shah, he actually develops a scientific system of transliteration from Arabic to Tamil. So basically marking Tamil letters with diacritics in order to represent each Arabic letter distinctively, very much like you see in Orientalist discourses. So the resistance against the Malayalam and Tamil scripts that you find among some of the traditionalists therefore becomes in itself a resistance against modernity. And finally, and this is my last slide really before I come to the conclusion, the final problem that you are actually faced with is the question of audience. So it may look or may sound strange to us nowadays, but it was indeed, as I had presented at the very beginning in the case of this libel case, that the use of the Malayalam or the Tamil script actually would make the Quran available to non-Muslims. And this was precisely something which many Muslims didn't feel comfortable with. So the very first Tamil script edition translation of the Quran that I've ever seen actually has this little note of caution in the corner at the beginning of the book, saying to protect this book from the hands of unbelievers is a matter of propriety for every single Muslim. So the basic thing is, don't hand this to anyone else because they can read it. If it was Arabic Tamil, they would still not be able to read it. No harm done if they get hold of the book. But here this is in Tamil script, so now suddenly they can read the Quran and then they can start abusing us. And so the traditional textual ethics basically said the Quran should only be made available to Muslims in translation. And this is where the reformist demand comes in, that Muslims have to share their scripture. They want to convert people. They want to also avoid that any suspicion is being directed against them, that people would say something like, oh, they don't want to show us their holy scripture because there must be really some problem with that scripture. That's why they don't want to show us the translation. And in order to sort of protect Muslims from getting a bad name as backward and as people believing in abstruse things among the other communities, it is necessary to basically place the Quran before these other communities. And this is where these early reform translation projects then take off, by basically saying, this has to be addressed as much to our own community as it has to be addressed to the Hindus and Christians who are reading the same languages. Ultimately, the shift to the Tamil and Malayalam scripts then becomes a matter of convenience as printing becomes easier, as also the education, the number of Muslims coming out of the ordinary schooling system where Tamil and Malayalam scripts are being taught become more and more. It becomes simply easier to ultimately shift from the Arabic script to the Tamil or Malayalam script. But the interesting thing is that in the beginning, this was a highly charged ideological question of which script do you use in order to publish your Quran translation. And I'll just put up these little, conclusions for you to see. I've already spoken over my time, and I'm looking forward to your discussion.